All right, we are back in the Fireside PM podcast. Good afternoon, team, and welcome to Elizabeth Creighton, who is joining us, and we're going to talk about UXR. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Tom. I'm so happy to be here. I don't think I've been on a podcast for maybe a year or something. So this is really exciting for me. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And you are an expert in a topic that I feel very passionate about. Many years ago, I took a boot camp around design thinking, and I kind of came back with a much different kind of understanding of user research than I had in the past, where I kind of thought it was like, well, that's like the anthropologists, like they'll go off and do their study and we'll kind of have a big presentation and then go back to our regular day. And I kind of feel like now it's so much more part of what a PM needs to be able to do or to partner with UXR when they have that luxury of a dedicated team. Why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dig into best practices and stuff like that.
Okay, sounds good. Well, nice to meet everyone who might be watching. So I'm a user experience researcher. I run a really small UX research consulting firm called Brazen. And I say it's really small because most of the time it's just me, and then I bring in other people to help out with projects that are maybe more than I can take on because my time is limited. I have a 2-year-old daughter, so only so much I can do at one time. So I've been running that business for almost 7 years, and it's been super fun. I'm someone who kind of always wanted to do their own thing and start their own business. Prior to starting this business, I worked at Shopify, where they really, the vibe is very entrepreneurial, and they encourage their employees to start their own businesses. They actually kind of encouraged me out of working there. Eventually, I left to start this thing. So yeah, I basically do. Research for clients kind of all over the world, mostly in US and Canada. I'm based near Toronto, so I get a lot of Canadian clients, and I do a mix of I guess what I would call like generative research, which is kind of like, clients come to me and they're like, we have a product and we have users, but we don't know who they are and what they want and what they need and why they use our product and what competitors they might be using, all that kind of stuff. And so I help them learn a bit more about who their users are and help them figure out what they should be creating next for them, basically. And then I also do research that's maybe a bit more evaluative. So usually they have, a product, an app, a website, whatever, and they might be aware that there could be some usability issues with it, or some people might be confused about the content or whatever, and they bring me in to kind of help them understand a bit more about where people are succeeding with whatever they've created, and where maybe it's not meeting people's expectations, they're having trouble using it, and turning to something else instead. So that's the kind of work that I do. And prior to doing this on my own, through my business, I was at Shopify for a few years working as a researcher on a bunch of different teams there. Most kind of prominently, I guess, the retail team. So anything related to selling in person with Shopify, which was super fun because I got to go to brick and mortar Shopify stores and, shadow merchants while they were making sales and talking to customers and stuff. And that was really cool. You don't get a lot of chances these days, especially like pandemic and stuff, to do in-person research. So I really enjoyed that. And then prior to that, I was living in San Francisco, working for, I guess, like a medium-sized startup called Prosper, which is like a peer-to-peer like marketplace lending platform. And then prior to that, I was living in Chicago, working at a UX research consulting firm there called Centralis, which is kind of where I first started to learn about UX research and where I first started to kind of get this idea of starting a consulting firm of my own one day. And then before that, I did a PhD in psychology. And I was definitely one of those people who did my PhD thinking I was going to stay in academia and have a lab and, run experiments and all that kind of stuff. And then about 6 months before I graduated, I had a massive freak out and was like, this is not what I want to do. What should I do instead? And thankfully came across UX research because it's been the ideal career for me, kind of sciencey enough to kind of satisfy that part of my brain while also having more flexibility than an academic job, and potentially, making more money. Like working in tech is generally a bit more lucrative, and you kind of have more opportunities there. So yeah, that's a bit about me. It's been a fun journey so far.
What a great journey it has been. And I guess maybe the first question I'd have for you is, especially given your work at Brazen, when should a team think about doing UXR themselves in-house versus working with an external partner? I kind of like the idea of the external partner because maybe they are less biased in favor of the product since they're not like colleagues and stuff. But how do you think about when you should do it, in-house versus getting help from outside?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like your instinct is right. That one of the nice things about being an external person is I generally have like no stake in the product at all. I don't personally care, kind of how things turn out. It can be really unbiased. And I can even when I'm talking to the participants say, I don't work at this company. I have no stake in this product. Please be very, honest and candid in your feedback today because you're not gonna hurt my feelings, which is nice to be able to say. Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, it's kind of hard. So a lot of companies don't have internal UX researchers, right? Some especially larger ones do, and that's awesome that they have those people they can kind of work with and take advantage of. I find that yeah, a lot of the clients I work with have no internal researchers, and they're often in situations where maybe their internal designers and PMs and content strategists and other people working on the product have been able to kind of get by doing a bit of research on their own, which is awesome. But I think that what they often struggle with is that they've never really had any like training in research, and so they kind of end up in these situations where either they're doing things like kind of inefficiently, like they don't really know like how to recruit participants easily, and they don't really know how to analyze data very well, so they're kind of doing things maybe slower and less efficiently than a trained researcher might. Or they're maybe a little bit nervous about doing research. I mean, especially when it comes to things like user interviews and stuff, like sitting with a stranger and talking to them can be really nerve wracking. And so some people don't feel comfortable with that, which is totally reasonable. And also there's the kind of issue of, yeah, because they're kind of much closer to the product than someone like I would be, the bias can kind of creep into the work that they do. And I'm happy to talk, about that in a lot of detail. But, if you're kind of close to the product, it's really hard to divorce your kind of personal feelings about the product and where you think it should be going and what you think users should want, from what people actually are saying, what they actually want. And so I find that like I often work really well with teams who are like interested in research and excited about research, but maybe don't feel like they're doing the best research on their own. And so often I'll be brought in to not just lead a research project, but also to kind of bring the team along for the ride and kind of like, teach them how to do research as we're going along. Which I guess kind of again, like sort of teaches me out of a job sometimes, but it's actually really rewarding when I talk to my clients and I find out that they've been kind of continuing with research on their own, taking some of the stuff I've taught them and actually putting it into practice, which is pretty cool. I guess one of the like advantages I guess about using an outside person besides the bias factor is that usually I can just kind of ramp up really quickly and get things done really fast. I mean, I've run like hundreds or I don't know, maybe thousands of research projects. I've done tons of interviews. It's really easy for me to know the steps that are involved and what I need to do. And I have, templates for things like I've done tons of interview guides, for example, and I have lots of questions I can draw from and I can create a really good guide really quickly. And so as opposed to maybe a research project taking, many weeks to kind of get through the recruiting process and talking to users and analyzing data and whatever, I can maybe get it done in a much shorter amount of time. And I find that teams often feel maybe a bit more confident in what I'm sharing with them in terms of the results than they would from their own analysis of the data, because they know that I'm like a trained researcher, and I think that sort of helps a bit.
When you have seen teams make the decision to do their own user research, and let's say they can't afford to hire an agency and they can't afford to hire a full-time internal researcher, so then they say, hey, the PMs are generally, problem solvers. They're like, okay, I'll go out and do some user research interviews. What do you see as like the most common mistakes that PMs make when they try and do their own user interviews?
Yeah, definitely the number one mistake, we've already talked about it a bit, is the bias thing that can kind of creep into the way they ask questions. This is actually also like the number one question I get about like how to do better research from PMs and everybody else is like how do I not lead the witness? How do I ask questions in a less biased way? So I mean there's kind of a few things you can do, or a few kind of stuff that's involved in that. I guess the first is even being aware of the fact that you have biases about your product in the first place. I mean, that's something that not everyone kind of really thinks about or is aware of. And actually, just doing like a little activity where you kind of jot down where you think your knowledge about the product comes from, and whether that's based on maybe research that was done in your company in the past, like actual data, or if it's just based on your kind of feelings about how people should experience your product, or maybe your own experiences of the product, and how, and you kind of assume other people are the same way as you, which isn't so great. So that's one thing you can do. One sort of thing that I think helps with this problem also is just doing good planning. I think a lot of PMs and other people who aren't dedicated researchers and might have a lot of other stuff on their plate just kind of like jump into calling people, like just jump into doing interviews without really thinking about what their research questions are, like what they're hoping to learn from the research, and what actual interview questions they might want to ask the person they're speaking with. And I find that like what helps me a lot is creating an interview guide or a discussion guide where I kind of like lay out, all the questions I want to ask, and making sure I'm writing them in ways that are maybe less likely to bias the participants. So the main thing I think about is like starting with as open-ended a question as possible for a given like line of questioning, and then sort of like narrowing in from there. So for example, if I was working at Shopify, and I was going to talk to some Shopify merchants, and I was really interested in whether they face any challenges related to like taking payments in particular. So this is what I'm interested in learning about is, what problems people are having related to taking payments. Like that's totally fine. A not so great way to ask questions around that would be, saying something like, taking payments is super challenging. We hear from a lot of merchants that they have a lot of problems with. Can you tell me about the sorts of problems you run into when it comes to taking payments? Like, that's not so great, because maybe the person didn't actually have any particular challenges related to taking payments. And you've kind of set this up as like, this is a problem you should be having. Tell us about why it's a problem for you. And that's not so great. And even like, I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, but even something as simple as starting by asking like, tell me about the challenges you face with taking payments. Again, that kind of biases the conversation towards like, oh, I guess I've been experiencing challenges, sure, but maybe these weren't things they would have thought of on their own. Maybe just the fact that I'm asking them about challenges specifically kind of primes them to try to dig through their head for challenges, because it sounds like that's what I want to hear, right? Maybe something better would be to say something like, what do you feel are some of the challenging aspects of running a Shopify store? And they can talk about whatever, and maybe payments comes up and maybe it doesn't. And if it starts to come up, you can, just something simple like, can you tell me more about that? That's really interesting to me. Or, why do you think it is that you're having those challenges? Or can you walk me through an example of a challenge you faced related to payments? Things like that. And then you kind of start really open-ended and then sort of dig a bit deeper. And if you like, let's imagine you ask them to tell them about challenges they face in their business and they don't mention anything related to payments. That doesn't mean that you should stop the interview and be like, okay, this person never has any challenges related to payments. That's not necessarily so great, but you can, you can talk to them about the challenges they raise themselves. And then you can say something like, do you ever feel like there's any aspects of taking payments that are challenging for you? Or is that not really something that's much of a challenge for you? You can kind of balance the question to kind of give them permission to talk about challenges, or to say, yeah, actually, it's not really been a bit of a big problem. That's why I didn't mention it before. So those are some kind of strategies I use. I honestly, everyone has issues with bias in questions. I do too. Everybody does. But starting as open-ended as possible, because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what they're going to say. And then kind of narrowing in deeper and deeper onto the thing that you really care about is great. And I guess if you plan during these interviews or sessions to show any aspect of your product, like get feedback on a prototype, for example, or whatever, I would stick to doing that towards the end of the session, so you can kind of get this sort of, unbiased feedback at the beginning, and then be like, hey, I wanted to show you an example of something we've been working on, XYZ, and kind of walk them through or whatever, as opposed to showing them at the beginning and then what they've just seen is kind of biased everything they're saying after that.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about the bias that the interviewer brings. I'm curious if you have thoughts on potential bias from the interviewee, where maybe they want to please you, or they they wanna be helpful, and they can kind of like maybe read your body language, and the team's all leaned in and smiling like, oh yeah, payments are terrible.
Totally. Yeah. And like again, that's an area where like I have an advantage of being an outside person. They might be less interested in pleasing me, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
Yeah, a few things I would do. So one is when I do these interviews, I often do them over Zoom or Hangouts or whatever, and I would limit the number of people who are watching. So aside from the person who's interviewing, whether it's a PM or
Hmm.
whoever, I would maybe have one other person viewing just to listen and take some notes and maybe asking some questions as well. But I wouldn't want it to feel like here's a crowd of Shopify people, talking to a merchant and they're all hanging on their every word, trying to
Hmm.
hear what they have to say. So that's one thing you can do to kind of make people feel a bit more comfortable. I also I have like a sort of a script, like an introduction script in my interview guides that I use that talks about that a little bit. Even if I were the PM and I couldn't say something like, I didn't create this product and I have no stake in it, that's okay. But I can at least say something like, it's really interesting for us to hear about what might have been going well so far, but it's also really interesting for us to hear about what's maybe been challenging or difficult, because we really learn from the areas where we're maybe not doing so well. So I really encourage you to be very honest and candid in your feedback today. That's one thing I kind of often
Hmm.
say, especially if the sort of setup might make it feel like, for the poor participants, like, oh, I'm watching this guy's like pet project, and now I have to give it criticism. That could be a little bit scary. So kind of just like setting up the idea of like, hey, we're going to learn the most from you when you are being really honest and candid, and you're comfortable saying stuff that's, might not be the sort of thing that the person who's creating this would maybe want to hear, because it helps us actually improve. So I would maybe kind of set things up that way a little bit.
Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on the different types of interviewing kind of formats? Like I've seen lots of user research interviews where it's the researcher and the interviewee, in a Zoom or a Google Meet or wherever.
Hmm.
And then I remember earlier in my career, I don't know, maybe this is not in fashion anymore, but we did some like field ethnography where we actually spent a lot of time just following the person around.
Yeah.
um, it was very expensive, but it also like was kind of helpful because you got to understand like, oh, our product is a very small percentage of their life,
Hmm.
and it kind of gave you like a different context. I was curious. Do you ever see people still do that type of user research, or is that considered like cost prohibitive or?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely still happens, and I love those projects because they're so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when you get to like, jump into someone's, context that you wouldn't normally be a part of. Like, for example, like I got a chance when I was at Shopify to fly to Australia and do a bunch of kind of like follow-alongs, I guess, with like merchants in
Mhm.
Australia. That was super cool. So it does happen. Like, for example, I did a project a while ago for Mozilla, and they were really interested in how people shop online, and in person, I guess. And as one kind of part of this, really big research project, we flew to people's homes at different cities across the US and Canada and like kind of sat with them while they showed us how they shop online. And that was super cool because you kind of get to see you know, like someone can talk about how they shop online in an interview, but it's so cool to sit with them and like they're trying to like make decisions while like a kid is screaming at them, or like they have to take the
Mhm.
dog out or like whatever, and you can kind of see how their home looks and maybe it's a bit disorganized and whatnot. And getting those sort of like rich contextual like bits is so much fun. But as you mentioned, they're usually really costly projects, especially if they involve travel or maybe paying participants a pretty high incentive to spend
Mhm.
that time with them. So I think it's great research to do if you can get the time and the budget for it, because you are going to learn more in a way than you would from a conversation that's happening over Zoom. But it can often be hard to convince people to do that sort of research.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's probably no coincidence that I was at a very, very large global corporation at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah. Nice.
Um,
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about B2C versus B2B research. Like, if someone's building a product for enterprise users or B2B users, do you see the approach of doing research any different than if you're kind of researching a consumer product or offering?
The main difference I see is that recruiting participants is usually very different for B2B than B2C. So if it's B2C, often you can get participants using like an online platform like userinterviews.com, for example. I use that platform a lot for B2C research. I find I get really great participants there, and it's pretty cheap to recruit them. So that's awesome. But when it comes to B2B research, often I'm working with companies who like they want me to do the research, but it's hard for them to give me access to their users, or they don't necessarily want to give access because they're kind of afraid of how the conversation might, affect the person's relationship with the company or the product or whatever. It's also sometimes hard because if you're doing B2B, then maybe the people you are able to contact are like the decision makers who you chose to use this product. So they may be relatively high up in the company, but maybe you wanted to actually talk to the end users who are actually using the software, right? Like imagine, you're interested in people who, I don't know, who like have purchased, they purchased Zoom for their large corporation or something like that. And maybe you're curious to talk to that decision maker, but you're maybe more interested in talking to the people who use Zoom on a day-to-day basis at the company and use the various like, crazy features that Zoom has these days. So it might be kind of hard to figure out who at that company to speak to and how to get access to those people. Cause you usually have to kind of like go through the gatekeeper, who's the person whose email address is like in the, the account or whatever. And you kind of have to go from there. So that's an issue I find sometimes. Another thing that can be difficult is like, for B2B stuff, you're usually working, you're trying to speak to professionals and they're busy and you might have to incentivize them pretty heavily to talk to you. So, whereas maybe talking to like, an average consumer for 45 minutes, I might pay them $50 or maybe $100 or something like that. If I'm doing B2B research, depending on who I'm trying to speak to, it could be like several $100s to get, 45 minutes or an hour of their time. And that can be, difficult to do if, you're a PM working at a company and just want to get a bit of buy-in to do some interviews. It might be hard to kind of get people to be okay with that. So that's an issue I see sometimes.
How do people think about, or how should people think about when to deploy user research as a investment versus one-on-one interviews versus like a quantitative survey
Hmm.
or analyzing customer support tickets? Like when's the right time to do like the classic user research interview versus the other kind of research methods?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think of interviews as really good for like going deep on certain topics, like really understanding like why people are doing certain things and like really get into like their thought processes and stuff. Like that's when I find it's most useful. Whereas something like surveys are really great for understanding like how many people are experiencing these issues, like how common are these issues, or these kind of behaviors or whatever. And I find that like because surveys are like can be relatively expensive to run, and like kind of like once you send out the survey, if you realize you've written a question not so great or maybe forgot to include a question, it can sometimes be difficult to make those changes. I find that what I like to do is start with some interviews because they're usually like it's usually not too difficult to like run a handful of interviews, for example, and use the data I get from the interviews to inform the survey questions, because I find that I'll learn things in the interviews that I wouldn't have thought to ask in the survey. I just wouldn't have had that knowledge yet. And so I find that like the data I get from that qual work helps me write good survey questions. For example, like maybe there's a survey question, I want to include a survey question around, which competitors to Shopify has this person tried before or something. And, I might have a sense of what the main competitors are, but maybe through some of these interviews, I learn about competitors I never had actually thought of and wouldn't have included those options on the survey, for example. So that's one reason why I like to do the qual first. Another is just that, yeah, when it comes to surveys, like surveys are not always, but like often, both more expensive to run, and it can take a while to get all the respondents that you're looking for, and also like depending on the skills of the people on your team could be more difficult to analyze. Like if you don't have anybody you're working with who has like quant analysis skills, that could be a barrier. When it comes to like analyzing support tickets and stuff, I think that's like kind of like a great, almost like ongoing activity you can do. Like, you can probably get access to the tickets through the customer service department at your company. And maybe you spend like an hour a week combing through tickets and jotting down your observations from those. It's not something you need to necessarily like spend a lot of time on, or a lot of money on. You don't need to talk to people to do it. You can just kind of like get those tickets, hopefully, and start taking a look, and maybe do some analysis where you're kind of like doing an affinity map or something, where you're kind of like figuring out what kind of themes you're getting out of that customer support research. Well, also, I guess, keeping in mind that like if someone's submitting a customer support ticket, they've obviously had a problem, and a lot of people might experience issues that they don't bother submitting a support ticket for example, because they think it'll be too complicated or too annoying, or not a big enough reason to submit a ticket or something. So you kind of have to be aware of like where your data is coming from. But I think it can be a good activity to kind of do, I guess, in parallel with other stuff you might want to do. So
Yeah, that reminds me. There's another angle, which is in the past I've worked in an enterprise software business where, for better or for worse, a lot of our sales meetings were sources of discussion topics subsequent afterwards around, oh wow, they kept asking about this, or
mhm.
they responded this way to our pitch. And on the one hand, it's like, well, they are people we're trying to sell to. We should listen to it. On the other hand, you wonder, like, ooh, is there a bias here? Like, are they kind of negotiating price already and trying to kind of steer us in one direction or another? What's your thoughts on how to make the best use of info you get from sales meetings or from the sales organization? That's like, hey, everybody keeps asking for feature 3, and all we have to do is build that, and we're good.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that like what people say they will do and what they say they want is maybe a bit different sometimes from what they will actually do and what they actually want, right? Like in these sales meetings, people might be talking about features they think they really want, but do they end up actually, if you were to create them, would they end up actually using them? Maybe not. So I think that like these sorts of sales meetings could be, I mean, an interesting opportunity to hear some things that are on people's minds, and maybe like get an idea of like the most requested features people have or something like that. But then I'd maybe want to take a step back and kind of like, um, kind of test those assumptions with maybe participants you're getting from a more kind of, I don't know, neutral source, I suppose, like, just your existing customer list, or maybe going on userinterviews.com and finding people who are not in the sales funnel and have never used your product before, and kind of testing those ideas with them as well. Maybe people who are using competitor products instead. So yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I don't think I've been in a situation where I personally have kind of uh, gotten access to that, I suppose. Like maybe I've just
Mm.
never worked at a company or worked for a company where they've been having these sales meetings and kind of saying like, hey, people keep complaining about X, or like people say they really want this feature. So I just haven't been in that situation, but it's interesting to think about that, and like kind of how to sort of balance the data you're getting from that with like, okay, but like people are saying they want this particular feature, but like should we then just go and jump and like make that feature, or is there any sort of
Mhm.
other validation we should be doing to kind of complement that?
Yeah, I always had mixed feelings about it because, on the one hand, I mean, those are the people that will often decide if they're going to buy the product or not.
Mhm.
And then on the other hand, you're like, I don't know, like maybe they think they want it. Maybe they're just, brainstorming in a meeting. And if you actually built it and came to them and said, okay, here it is, you asked for it, like, would they really pull out their wallet and sign the big enterprise agreement because of that feature?
Yeah.
Um, or maybe for me, it's like, well, why are they asking for that? Like, what is this
Yeah.
problem that they're trying to solve? Let's kind of double click a little more into that. Um, Given that it's 2024, I should ask you about AI.
Sure.
And there's like 8 billion startups that seem to take notes
Yeah.
and summarize a meeting. I'm wondering, have you had any experience using AI for your user research, like as a tool?
Okay, this is a great question, because if you'd asked me this like 6 months ago, I'd be like, "Oh, I haven't touched it. I don't really care."
Mhm.
But I gave a workshop at a conference like a month or two ago called "Your AI Research Assistant," where I kind of talked about this stuff, because I'd in the past few months had like actually gotten into using some of these AI tools. So yeah, it's a tricky user research is a tricky area to use AI based stuff, because you obviously care about like getting an accurate representation of your data, and not necessarily like not hopefully not having to worry too much about like the bias that AI models can introduce to what you have, right? So I guess backing up for a second. So the way I think about using AI in my work is always with a human companion, always with me double checking its work, and I try to like think of maybe more like tedious, like time saving sorts of tasks that AI can help me with. So for
Mhm.
example, like if I have to write like an interview guide for a project I have coming up, I might ask ChatGPT to like can you create a draft of an interview guide for a 45-minute qualitative user interview, keeping these 4 research goals in mind, one, two, three,
Mhm.
four, and I'll see what it comes up with, and I'll take that as one input into the guide that I create. And sometimes it comes up with maybe questions I hadn't thought of it, initially, kind of saves me a bit of time there, or maybe particular wording that I hadn't thought of, which is nice. I've also sometimes used it to, I usually, like when I'm writing an interview guide, I always put too many questions in, and then I'll sometimes ask it to trim down the guide to a certain time length, again keeping in mind a particular set of research goals, and it'll kind of identify questions that maybe aren't that high priority when I think about what my goals actually are, and that's actually been helpful for me sometimes. Yeah, when it comes to transcribing and note taking, so I'm kind of old school. I still take my own notes by hand usually, or like in Google Docs or whatever. But I pretty much always get transcripts created, because I find that like I don't want to spend too much of my mental energy taking notes, because I want to be able to listen to what the person is saying, of course. And so I'll use a tool called Notably.ai,
Mhm.
and it's a great tool. Like what I do is I'll take my Zoom recordings, I'll put them into Notably, and it'll transcribe each of my recordings, and it'll let me kind of go through the transcript and highlight things that I think should be highlighted, and kind of tag them with different tags. And this is like a super good like shortcut for me for doing analysis. I'll just kind of like skim through the transcript, tag different things with the kind of themes that seem to be coming out of the research or topics that I'm interested in. And what it'll do is it'll actually attach like that part of the video to that highlight, so I can kind of go back and see what the person said, and what maybe what meant, yeah, what body language they were using or whatever.
Mhm.
And then I can use the tool to do some affinity mapping, where all of these little tagged highlights get put on little sticky notes and kind of grouped into different themes, and I can kind of like get a good sense of what sorts of themes came out of the research, and start to figure out what the sort of the insights, I guess, from the research were. And it has a function where it will kind of do like an AI summary of like what the top challenges you heard and the top
Mhm.
opportunities and whatever. And I find that these summaries are okay. Like they kind of usually maybe like supplement a bit the work that I'm doing. But again, like they're not the sort of thing where you just like take that summary and give it to your boss. Like it definitely requires a human to kind of comb through and be like, wait a minute, like it's suggesting this, but like only one person actually mentioned that. Like that's kind of silly, things like that. So I find it's like my favorite AI based tool for everything kind of like analysis related, everything from after you're done the interview, basically.
Yeah, that sounds super cool.
Yeah.
Tell me about a time where you felt like user research you did had the biggest impact on a product success. Like, what was the insight, or the pivot, or the kind of kernel that really ended up driving kind of results for the company?
Yeah, so this will be a story that sort of hits on what you want to say, but it's like a bit of a curveball. So again, this is when I was working at Shopify. I feel like I'm pulling a lot of examples from there. I was working on the retail team, and one of the things we were working on was one of the credit card readers that Shopify had come out with. And
Hmm.
this was like several years ago, so I'm sure they have like a bigger, fancier one now. But I believe we were at like a not a farmer's market, but one of those kind of like a trade show or something, where people are
Hmm.
kind of selling stuff. And we contacted some merchants ahead of time, so we could come and basically like shadow them while they tried to set up this credit card reader using the Shopify software on their phone. So we were really curious to see what people would do. And the way that this credit card reader worked was it synced through Bluetooth with your phone, so you could like do a transaction on your phone, and then it would show up on the credit card reader, and someone could use it. But what was sort of strange about it, I guess, is that instead of like syncing using the Bluetooth syncing, I guess, in the Bluetooth section of your phone settings, you had to do it through the Shopify app. And so I think a lot of people have this mental model that when you're using a new Bluetooth thing, you go into the Bluetooth settings, and for example, on my iPhone, and find it there and then like pair it that way. Whereas this was kind of going against that mental model that people might already kind of have, that instead they actually have to go into the Shopify app and pair there, as opposed to where they go to pair all their other stuff like their
Hmm.
headphones and their speakers and whatever. But we weren't actually sure if this was going to be a big problem, so we tested it out, and yeah, it was a huge problem. I think almost everybody we shadowed would get to the point where they're trying to pair, and they were looking, they'd open up the Bluetooth settings and they couldn't find it. They'd be like, oh, I don't know if it's like maybe it's broken or something, like it's not showing up here. I guess it's not sending the signal. And we would kind of ask them questions without really revealing what was going on. And I think that most of the people we spoke to would have ended up just like scrambling to find another solution because they thought it was totally broken. They couldn't get it to work at all. Only a couple of people thought to go like to open up the Shopify app to like see if there's somewhere they could go in there to try to pair it instead. And so this was really interesting to us because we didn't really realize people had this really strong mental model that like Bluetooth stuff happens in Bluetooth settings, not anywhere else. And so the reason why this is a curveball, a bit different from the story you requested, is because I remember myself and the other people I was working with kind of, went to the company and, presented our research and told them about this. And I think we were told that due to whatever constraints, they weren't actually able to like make that change. So they actually had to release it without that change being made. And we were like, this doesn't sound so good because people are probably going to have a bit of a problem. And I remember feeling very, very vindicated, but also kind of sad, I guess, that like several months later, when we were talking to someone about support tickets, it turns out there's like this huge influx of support tickets about that very issue where people thought that there was something wrong with their credit card reader when actually like it was okay. So that's kind of an example of where I guess in this case the research wasn't listened to so much, and then there was a negative impact instead. But it was a really interesting project, one that'll kind of always stick with me, because just seeing all these people try and fail to do this thing that to us maybe seems so simple, like to the people I was working with, they're like, oh, of course people will figure this out. Not so much. So
Yeah, I would not be surprised if you went back in time, there were probably a million meetings and reviews on all kinds of experiences using the app, and this flow and that flow and this feature and that feature. And I'm not even sure if there might have been a single review on like, and this is how they set it up. And by the way, they probably, many of the demos started with, okay, you got your app connected, here's how they swipe their card.
yeah.
And so it's so true. And I've seen this in other products as well, where the team and you as a PM are such an expert on your product that you completely lose touch with the reality of what the user's life is really like, and how you're trying to insert your product, this foreign body, into this environment. And like if they can't get that Bluetooth hooked up, they'll probably not even going to try after that, and just be like, oh, I guess the Shopify one doesn't work, I'll use something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, tough stuff. One last question, and then we should talk about your class.
Oh, right.
What do you do when you have some key results and insights from the research, and you feel like, hey, I've uncovered some very important information here, and the audience internally is really looking for confirmation on what they've spent the last 2 years building, and they don't embrace the recommendations. Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I say the first thing I do is like before I've even done the research, I kind of try to set the expectation that like I don't think I've ever done research where we've found 100% great stuff that totally aligns with what we already thought. We always find stuff that it's like, whoa, I never would have thought that that would happen. Like things like that are kind of maybe could be show stopping, or could just be like maybe major negative things we wouldn't have expected to come out. There's always stuff that we didn't expect to happen, so I kind of like try to set the expectation ahead of time. And I also try to make sure that I'm getting involved when there still is time to make changes, because I find that I've been in situations sometimes where I've been working, like when I worked at this startup in San Francisco, and I was the only researcher, so everyone came to me for research, and they'd be like, okay, we need to do research on X, Y, and Z, and I'd be like, okay, like, yep, that sounds important. What's the kind of timeline like? Like how much I'll be able to get it done in a couple of weeks, and then you can have some time to make changes. And they'd be like, oh well, we're releasing it by the end of the week, so like we're not actually going to be able to do anything based on the research. We just know that we need to do the research, and that's always kind of like disheartening to hear. Where I think they kind of thought that everything was going to be pretty much fine, and so they didn't actually really bake in any time to make changes based on the research. Yeah, that can be a really tough situation to be in when your audience you just feel so bad because you're like, your audience really thinks things are going to go one way, and they're kind of banking on that happening, and then you have to be kind of like, actually, like, there are some pretty serious issues we uncovered, or like, actually, like, nobody we spoke to seemed to have the sort of problem that you think you're going to solve with this product, so who's going to actually want to use it, that kind of thing. And I mean, there's kind of a mix. I mean, some people you're just not going to convince. They're just really, really set in their ways. One thing that can certainly soften things, or kind of provide a bit more firepower, I guess, is I always record my sessions, as long as the other person is comfortable with it, and sharing not just quotes from the sessions, but also like video of things people said, like actually being able to put like faces to the comments. Because I've been in a situation one time, I remember, where like I was working at this consulting firm, and we presented to some big company, and like the CEO or whoever was like, "Oh, well, you probably just got stupid people in your sessions. Like if you'd gotten the right people, you would have gotten the kind of results that we were hoping to get." And like, I just kind of had to we had to show the person, like, here's some video of like real users. In this case, it was a usability test, like having significant difficulty like doing the sorts of things that you want your product to be able to do. And as you can kind of tell, these are pretty reasonable, normal people who are trying really hard. And that kind of turned things around when they could actually see and hear people have these difficulties or talk about their problems. That was really helpful. Because yeah, I mean, the most frustrating thing is you put all this time and effort into research, and then people don't want to take action on what you found, right? That's not great.
Yeah, I totally agree. When you see the video of the user desperately trying to perform the task and like completely struggling, it's so humbling.
Yeah.
And also, like, when you see the user talk about their problems, and then you realize, like, oh, the problem like we're trying to solve is not their biggest problem.
Yeah, that's always hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and you if the researcher just says, okay, here are the bullet points, we've concluded that this product's not really pointing in the right direction, users don't think it's a big issue or whatever. I think our bias for all of our sunk costs and whatever conviction we had and intuition can sometimes overcome that kind of research summary. But when you have to watch the vignettes,
Yeah.
or you're just even reading the quotes, and then you see the little pictures of the person and their role and their whatever, and you're like, oh, well, either they're all wrong,
Yeah.
or they just need to see it in more, and then the light bulb will come up. I'm guessing you probably hear one objection, which is like, oh, well, if Henry Ford asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
Totally.
So,
Yeah.
they just don't get it. Like, they're gonna love it. Don't worry. How do you respond to that argument?
I mean, the thing is, like, when we do these interviews, again, we're trying to ask open-ended questions, trying to get at like what people
Mhm.
are, what problems they're really experiencing without us biasing them in a certain way. And if they don't happen to mention any problem related to whatever the, like, faster horse or whatever would be, then like probably it's not gonna do so well. And I mean, it doesn't mean that like when someone sees a cool new product, they aren't going to want to use it. Sure, but if that thing is ultimately not solving a problem in their life, they're not going to keep using it or like buy the next version or whatever, because they're going to realize it's not actually providing any major value or benefit for them. Yeah, it's funny that quote. I feel like that quote gets like used and abused so much.
It's terrible. It's so terrible. It's like license to just do whatever the hell you want. It's like,
Yeah,
yeah, you don't
yeah.
really care what the customers say. What about the flip side, where the customers are wowed by the mocks or the demo, and they're like, oh my god, this is a game changer, this is amazing, and then you launch it, and then you realize like, oh, it doesn't really solve the problem the way they thought, or they were just
Mhm.
overly enthusiastic about how cool this thing was. How do you kind of de-risk that other side of the equation?
Yeah, if I had like a product in mind that I was, planning to release, and I thought that I wanted to kind of figure out if people would really, really use it, I'd probably ask them to, I'd show them the product or describe the product or whatever at some point in the interview, maybe, and I would maybe ask them like, can you tell me about a time when you would have used this product for something if you'd had it available to you, and what would you have been using it for? And if they're kind of like, well, they can't really think of anything, then that's a bit of data to have. You can also ask them about like, can you tell me about like, imagine there's a situation in the future where you think you would actually use this for your work or whatever. Tell me about what kind of situation that might be. And that's not quite so good because like people can, you can kind of talk about things that might happen that, in reality, maybe you wouldn't have actually done that, but it's another way you can kind of get at that. But yeah, I think it all comes down to like understanding what problems people really, really have, and then designing the solutions that fit those problems rather than coming up with the solutions and then making sure there's a problem that is being solved by that solution, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, totally. Now you're getting ready to launch a class on Maven around user interview skills.
Hmm.
And so I'm going to share. There's a
Oh,
link.
nice.
Yeah, there's a link in the description for folks who want to check it out. And thank you for the Fireside PM discount, so people can get $50 off, which is nice. But yeah, what will they get out of the class? Like, what kinds of stuff are you going to talk about?
I mean, basically, I'm just gonna, offload from my brain everything I've learned over the past like 12 years of user trees somehow in like a 2 week long time period. So just to kind of back up, so I have been leading trainings for clients for the past few years, and usually the teams I'm teaching are not other researchers; they're PMs and designers and developers and other kind of research adjacent, product people. And that's kind of like what clients come to me for fairly often. And I was kind of like, hey, maybe I should actually just like teach this as a more public facing course, so like anybody with a bit of a bit of a training budget or whatever can like join and learn this sort of stuff too, because not every company has like the resources to bring in someone like me to come and come and teach. And so this course is really just like, I don't know if this is a common phrase. I feel like I've heard this in my life, soup to nuts, like from the beginning to the end, how
Hmm.
to run user interviews, everything from like, you know, um, understanding like what you should be, what kind of topics you should be researching, and how to write like a pretty simple research plan to kind of get your thoughts together, and how
Hmm.
to write those sort of non-leading questions in your interview guide, and what to do with the data. Actually, when you're in the interviews, like how to make the person feel comfortable talking to you, and how to ask those questions, and what to do with the data after, all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to share like not just the sorts of things I do, but I'll also be sharing kind of like templates and examples that you can download that'll sort of help you kind of get started. And I think the key to the course, I feel like this is like a very Maven sort of thing, is like a lot of interaction. So there's gonna be a lot of like activities, a lot of feedback being given by me. Like I'm hoping to be able to give a lot of personalized feedback to everyone, either kind of like live in the sessions or through the projects that people will be submitting. So yeah, it's like a 2 week long course with a few live sessions each week, and some kind of pre-recorded lessons as well that people can work through, and a couple of projects along the way. And the idea is you can like start the course with never having done an interview before, and by the end, like not only will you know how to do it, but you'll actually have gotten practice doing it with other people in the class, and even some practice analyzing data and stuff as well. So you should hopefully feel pretty confident and skilled to like actually start doing this at your company. You'll become like a mini researcher, I guess, at your company.
Love it. Well,
Mhm.
I encourage people to check out the class. I'm sure it would pay off for years onward as a PM, because sometimes you may not have the budget to have a UXR team or to hire an agency, and you have to do it. And uh, anyone can do a user research interview, but not everyone can do a good one.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
you sometimes you can actually like get yourself into trouble, especially if you've got this confirmation bias that I think a lot of PMs like. Of course, we believe in what we built or what we want to build. Um, Tell us a little bit about how people can stay in touch with you, Elizabeth, and any other tips before we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. I am on Twitter as Eliz Creighton. So like just the first few letters of my name. I think that I'm the only one. So if you can, you'll see my face if you look for me there. On LinkedIn under my name as well. My website, if you're interested in either like training for your team, like kind of private training or consulting, is brazen.io. So brazen.io. My email is elizabeth@brazen.io. And I'm going to be hopefully I'm working on it. I'm trying to launch like a newsletter soon. I was hoping to get that ready for this podcast, but I did not. So I'm working on launching a newsletter that's for, again, like designers and PMs who want to start doing their own research. I'm just kind of sharing tips along the way, interviews with other kind of UX leaders, my favorite resources, like discount codes to courses and stuff I might be creating. And so if you're interested in that, I wish I had a place to direct you, but I don't. You can hit me up at my email, elizabeth@brazen.io, and I can hook you up with that when it's ready. But yeah, thank you so much, Tom. It was so nice to talk to you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. And maybe my last question is, if there's one piece of advice for PMs out there to do better user research interviews, what would it be?
Think of it as testing assumptions, not validating what you already think is correct, right?
Mm,
That's like a kind of a mindset shift that I think is really important. It's like I hear the word validate a lot. I think I used it once at some point in this conversation, and like I generally don't like it because it kind of assumes like things are good and you just need to validate that, yes, like check that box, I've done my research, everything is okay. When really you should think about it as like I have some assumptions about our users and about our product, and that's why I think we should create this feature, or that's why I've created this product or whatever, and I need to test those assumptions to see if I've actually made correct assumptions, and hopefully like challenge those assumptions and refine them, so they're more accurately reflecting what's really going on in the world. So that is my final piece of advice.
I love it.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for coming on, Elizabeth, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks so much, Tom.
Take care.
You
Bye.
too. Bye bye.
All right. Elizabeth Creighton. Yeah, the whole point about testing assumptions brought up this visual in my mind, which is like every product is built on a Jenga tower of assumptions. And maybe part of user research is figuring out like which of those assumptions is wrong, because there's for sure going to be some wrong assumptions in there. And yeah, Mike Plummer is agreeing, saying, yeah, testing it, yeah, is totally. I that really resonated with me as well. Well, hopefully you all found this conversation useful. If you like these types of interviews, do me a solid and like and share. And then in the comments, let me know if you have any tips or suggestions for how to do user research better, or questions that you wish that we had gotten to that we didn't in the interview. And maybe I can ask Elizabeth to reply to the questions in the comments below. And then if you are also interested in a class with me, I'm teaching one on business strategy for PMs. Basically, it's kind of like MBA level business strategy training for PMs, usually who don't have an MBA. And then another one around how to nail your exec product reviews. And then I might do one in the future, kind of like a PM boot camp, but I don't know. I feel like there's a few of those already out there. But let me know in the comments if you think any of those would be interesting. And you can check out my classes at maven.com/Tom L. All right. See you guys later, and let's all get back to work.